The Monkey's Paw, Part 1. It was snowing hard. Inside the cabin, a log fire burned brightly. John had brought his Xbox. It was the latest model. Charlie and his younger sister were marveling at the insanely realistic graphics. It was a light machine and fit easily into John's pack-sack. He had come down the hill to spend the evening. "This controller is sick. It vibrates really strong," said Susan. She glanced over at John. He was focused on the television screen. She noticed the curve of his ski jump nose. "Your Wi-Fi's pretty good here. Getting a short ping. It's better than my place," he said without taking his eyes off the screen. "Your screen is bigger. Next time we go to your place," said Charlie. "My dad is home all the time. He's always parked in front of the TV, or he's yelling at me." "Well, you can always come play here. Our dad is always out all night working the slopes." Giggles came from the door of the den. It was the twins. They were being obnoxious as usual. "Don't let your nose poke the TV, John," screamed one of the twins. They howled with laughter and ran back towards the living room. "Don't mind them. They're just being jerks as usual," said Susan. "Oh, come on. I like the twins," said John. "Yeah, I've noticed," said Charlie. "You chase them around as much as they chase you." "I like kids. Always have." He glanced at Susan. "Would you like to have kids someday, S?" John liked to call Susan by the letter of her first name. S, he would always say. Sure, I guess," Susan managed to get out. She felt her face redden. John flicked the controller. The video game audience erupted in applause. "Nice shot," said Charlie. "Go big or go home," said John. "Speaking of go big or go home, guess who's coming over to visit Dad?" "Who?" "Todd Lautner." "Todd Lautner? No way! What's he doing here? Last I heard, he was shredding in some movie for somebody in India." "He's going to retire. Wants to get away from riding for a while. My dad's setting him up with the snowmaking job." "That's a change of scenery." "He's got a girl for sure. Maybe he wants to get married," said John. Susan felt herself blush again. They heard footsteps on the balcony. The door's deadbolt was frozen as usual. They heard their father rustling in the bin by the door for a small hammer they kept there. A few bangs of metal against metal sounded. Their father's voice was warm and enthusiastic as he welcomed their guest. "Guys," shouted Dad from the other room, "come and say hi to Todd." Todd Lautner was a legend. He had turned pro 5 years ago and had already been in a dozen movies. But now he looked different from what the three remembered. He was red-faced. He had put on weight. He looked older. Todd had brought a bottle of wine to thank Mr. Marks for the job. Mr. Marks opened the bottle and brought 2 glasses to the table where they were sitting. After a glass of wine, Todd's eyes got brighter and he began to talk. The family was all in the kitchen now, all leaning forward as Todd told stories of skiing and movies. Producers were bringing skiers to ever more far-flung places in East Asia in search of the perfect shot. John spoke of wars that were being fought just over borders. He talked about climbing the steps of ancient temples. He spoke of marketplaces brimming with strange goods and people. "I'd like to go to India," said Mr. White. "It's nicer here," said Todd. "I'd like to see the temples and the marketplace and the jugglers and the fakirs." "What's a fakir?" asked Susan. "A holy man," said Todd. "You can find them in the monasteries in Tibet, or living in caves in the lowlands, or in secret corners in the marketplace. What was that souvenir you picked up you were telling me about on the phone? A monkey's paw?" said Mr. White. "Nothing," said Todd hastily. "Monkey's paw?" said Charlie curiously. "Well, it's some old-school magic thing," said Todd, chuckling. "It's just an ordinary little paw that's been dried out like a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and put it on the table. Susan made a face and moved her head back. "Gross," she said. Charlie picked it up and examined it carefully. "So what's special about it?" he asked. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said Todd. "A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with fate did so at their own risk. Supposedly he put a spell on it. 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." Todd seemed very serious, and the other listeners' light laughter felt out of place. "Well, did you have your 3 wishes?" said Charlie cleverly. Todd looked at Charlie the way an old man looks at a young man. "I did," said Todd. Susan thought she could see his face whiten. "And did you have your 3 wishes granted?" Charlie asked. "I did," said Todd. "And has anybody else wished? You said there were supposed to be 3 people." "The first man had his 3 wishes. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was to die. That's how I got the paw." Todd was so serious that there was silence in the bright room. "Well, if you've had your 3 wishes, what do you keep it for?" asked Charlie. He was looking hard at Todd. "I don't know," said Todd. "For fun, I guess. Good conversation piece." Todd took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it onto the log fire. "Hey!" said Charlie. He stooped to snatch it off the fire. "Let it burn, man," said Todd solemnly. "It's gross," said Susan. "Let it burn." "It's cool," said Charlie. "It's a piece of history. If you don't want it, give it to me." "No way," said Todd seriously. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Toss it back on the fire. Be smart." Charlie shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you do it? How do you make a wish?" he asked. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud. But dude, I'm warning you." "Wish for a new back for me, Charlie," said Mr. White. "Mine is killing me." He stretched. They laughed. Charlie looked down at the talisman. Todd looked alarmed. "If you have to wish, at least wish for something smart." Charlie put the paw into his pocket. "I'm hungry. Are we going to eat?" A second bottle of wine appeared. A pizza arrived. Everyone was enthralled with Todd's second installment of his adventures in India. He left before it got too late. The twins and Mr. White went to bed. Susan, Charlie, and John sat in front of the fire. Charlie took the paw out of his pocket. "I don't know what I would wish for. Seems to me I've got everything I want." "How about a new Xbox?" said Susan. "What are they running now? $700? Charlie smiled. He held up the talisman. John winked at Susan. "I wish for $700, said Charlie. "Dun dun dun," sang John, lowering his voice. Charlie shouted. He dropped the talisman. Susan and John sat up and stared at him. "It moved," he shouted as he stared at the thing that was now lying on the floor. "It moved in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see any money," said John, "and I bet I never will." "Are you sure it wasn't your imagination?" asked Susan. "I could have sworn the thing moved," he chuckled. "Did you hear me scream?" They relaxed by the fire again. Outside, the wind was blowing harder than ever. The snow was piling up. A silence came over the 3 of them. John wished them good night. "I bet you'll find the cash under your pillow, with some gremlin sitting in the corner of your room watching you pocket it," said John. Susan walked him to the door. Charlie heard murmuring voices from the front door, Susan's giggles, and then silence. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire. He saw faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It was vivid. He let out an uneasy laugh. He felt on the table for a glass of water to throw on the face. His hand grasped the monkey's paw. With a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his shirt and went up to bed. Part 2. Saturday was the annual Mount Folsom Open. John and Charlie were both competing. Competing is an interesting word. The 2 had been best friends since birth, but everyone knew who was going to win the competition. John had always been the best rider, and he was expected to easily win the competition, even though some heavies were coming in from out of town. It was a big show. Sponsors had the place tricked out with promotional booths. There was food and drink and stands for spectators to sit and watch the halfpipe. As was expected, John wowed the crowd and took first place. Charlie placed second, but only by a small margin. It was a great day of competition. The prize ceremony was at 8 o'clock in the main lodge. After the competition, Susan and Charlie went back to the house to change and have a quick bite to eat. Susan could not help thinking about the wish her brother had made the week before. She wondered if there would be a raffle at the prize ceremony. She decided she would buy a ticket. The dirty, shriveled little paw was out of sight and out of mind on the corner of the mantelpiece. They sat at the kitchen table. "Will you be staying late at the medal ceremony?" asked Charlie. Susan made no response. She was staring out the window at a car that had just pulled up. It was an industry car. It had decals of sponsors and brand names plastered over every inch. A guy in a high-end ski suit stepped out of the passenger door. He walked to the front of the car. He walked to the rear hatch. He opened it and rummaged around. He walked to the driver's side door. He conversed with someone through the half-open window. He looked at the house. He looked back at the car. He paused again. He stood up straight and walked up the path to the house. Susan set to opening the door. As usual, the main latch was stuck with frost. The deadbolt had to be hit with a small hammer with the hammer. She invited the visitor in. He stood uncomfortably by the door. "I was asked to come by personally. I'm from the prize committee for the event. There will be no medal ceremony tonight." "Why not?" asked Charlie. He sat down at the table. "There was an accident. We know you guys were friends, so I was asked to drop this off personally." "What happened?" Susan said breathlessly. "Did anything happen to John? Is he hurt?" "Badly hurt, I'm afraid," said the man quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, good, good. They must have him juiced up on drugs. Is he at the clinic?" She paused as the meaning of the comment sunk in. She turned to Charlie and put her trembling hand in his. "He had gone back up the hill for an interview. The maintenance crew was doing teardown. He hit the shovel of a snowcat and then got caught in the tracks in the tiller," said the high-end ski jacket. "Caught in the tiller?" said Charlie in a daze. He stared out the window. The man shuffled his feet and coughed. "The organizers know how close you guys were. They asked me to deliver this. It's the medals and the prize money." Charlie and Susan gazed at the visitor in horror. Charlie's lips shaped the words, "How much?" $700, was the answer. Charlie was unconscious of Susan's long shriek as he bumped his forehead on the table. Part 3. The Newtown Cemetery was 2 miles from the house. John's father wanted him laid to rest there, even though their house was only considered a vacation home. The family and friends buried the dead. Susan and Charlie came back to a silent house. It was all over so quickly, they could hardly realize it. They remained in a state of expectation, as though something else was going to happen, something that would lighten the load. But the days passed, and expectation gave way to resignation. Susan and Charlie sometimes did not say a word to each other, as if they had nothing to talk about. About a week later, Charlie woke suddenly in the night. The room was dark. The sound of subdued weeping came from the downstairs. He sat up in bed and listened. He crept down the stairs. He saw Susan at the window. "Come back upstairs," he said. "You'll get cold." "It's a lot colder for John." She stifled a powerful sob. Charlie's eyes were heavy with sleep. He went back to his warm bed. He slept restlessly. Suddenly, Susan's cry woke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" Charlie sat up in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" he said. Susan came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You didn't burn it, did you?" It's on the mantelpiece, in the corner. Why? Susan cried and laughed at the same time. It just occurred to me. I don't know why I didn't think of it before. Why didn't you think of it? Think of what? Questioned Charlie. The other 2 wishes, she replied rapidly. We've only had one. Wasn't one enough? He demanded fiercely. No, let's have one more. Come downstairs and get it. Let's wish John alive again. Are you going crazy? Come on, come downstairs. Just like before, in front of the fireplace. We had one wish granted, why not a second? Susan said feverishly. It was a coincidence, stammered Charlie. Come on, come downstairs, said Susan, quivering with excitement. Charlie stared at Susan. He's been dead 10 days, and besides, he's unrecognizable. It was a closed casket. He hit the front shovel of the snowcat. He went under the tracks. He went under the tiller. How could you look at him? We can bring him back. I've known him my whole life. He was going to marry me. How can I be afraid of him? They went downstairs in the darkness. The talisman was still on the corner of the mantelpiece. Charlie was gripped by a horrible fear that his mutilated friend would appear before him, before he could escape the room. Charlie's brow was cold with sweat. He held the unwholesome thing in his hand. Susan's face seemed changed as she looked at him. It was white and expectant. It had an unnatural look. He was afraid of her. Wish, she cried in a strong voice. This is not a good idea, he said. Wish, she repeated. He raised his hand. I wish my best friend alive again. The talisman fell to the floor. He looked at it fearfully. He trembled and sank into a chair. Susan's eyes burned. She walked to the window and looked out. Charlie sat until he became cold. He watched his sister looking out of the window. The fire was only smoking embers. An occasional flame threw pulsing shadows on the ceiling and walls. He went back upstairs to his bed. Later he heard the stairs creak as Susan came upstairs. The darkness was oppressive. The fire had gone out. Charlie awoke from the cold. At the same moment, a barely audible knock sounded on the door. He caught his breath. A third knock sounded louder through the house. What's that? Said Susan, sitting up in her bed in the other room. Just the wind, said Charlie, his voice shaking. Go back to sleep. It's John, she screamed. The twins began to cry. She ran into the hallway, but Charlie was there before her. He held her arm tightly. What are you going to do? He whispered hoarsely. It's my husband. I love him. It's John, she cried. She struggled mechanically to get free from him. I forgot it's 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I have to open the door. You can't let that thing in, shouted Charlie, trembling. You're afraid of your best friend, she cried, still struggling. That's why he always wins. Let me go. I'm coming, John. There was another knock, and another. With a sudden wrench, Susan broke free and ran down the stairs. Charlie followed and ran to the mantelpiece. He could hear Susan working the lock. Where's the hammer? Susan shouted. Her voice was strained and panting. I can't get the bolt open without the hammer. Help me find it. Charlie was on his hands and knees, groping wildly under the chairs for the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house. He heard the rummaging in the toolbox as Susan searched for the hammer. He heard the bang and the squeak as she hit the frozen bolt. At the same moment, he found the monkey's paw. He frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard a last clink of steel against steel. He heard the door open. A cold wind rushed into the house. A long wail of disappointment and misery gave him courage to run to Susan. Then he ran to the end of the path. A wisp of snow spun upwards into the night. The street lamp flickered on a quiet and deserted road. This has been The Monkey's Paw, written by Paul Beck and W. Jacobs, narrated by Melissa Fabregas. Production copyright 2021, Trout Lake Media.